please welcome Professor John Holmwood. I will not introduce the proper title. It's Postcolonialism.
Well, Colonialism, Postcolonialism, and the liberal welfare state. So part of that background is relevant. I mean, I was at the University of Birmingham and head of department, and the department was closed by the university. So this gave me an acute interest in the politics of knowledge, and particularly the politics of higher education. There is a process of the privatisation of universities in the UK, so the privatisation of public universities through a new funding regime of fees. And so I became interested in neoliberalism as a project of knowledge and related to higher education. And then difficult to think about neoliberalism and its effects without, in a sense, trying to address what is missing in the idea of liberalism and neoliberalism. And particularly since neoliberalism seems to be having so many negative effects in the area and issues around race, what is paradoxical is the absence of any real discussion of the racialization of liberalism itself. So that's partly what this project is about thinking about how the liberal welfare state, and I use that generally, how it has a structure determined by a history of colonialism. So the issue of postcolonialism is to think of postcolonialism not simply as issue of others to whom colonialism happened, but also think of colonialism as structuring the nature of the institutions of Europe and North America in particular, or one might say Europe and the white dominions of the British Empire, which is America, Canada, New Zealand, Australia. So I include them as Europe as a consequence of that particular history. So let's begin. And obviously there's an immediate crisis, that of refugees in Europe, and a lot of people talk of refugees in Europe as a crisis confronted by Europe as opposed to reflecting a crisis of Europe, that is, in the meaning of Europe in its response to others. So the issue of race is central to the current politics in Europe. It's obviously central to Brexit. Britain's leaving the European Union is in relation to the issue of immigration, and of course the Trump election in the USA is strongly organised along racial themes. This also, I think, reflects probably 20 or 30 years, and one can think of Piketty's book as an important statement of what we knew but didn't really know so fully consciously or make it so central to things, of the widening inequalities that have taken place since the 1980s, returning inequality in most European countries to levels not previously seen since the late 19th century. So a return to the high inequalities of capitalism, and this taking place through an issue around globalization. So we have a paradox of accentuated globalization. So when you think of Brexit, Brexit is supposed to be a response of those who are left behind, and yet the policies of the government that is pushing forward on Brexit is a policy of deregulation and accentuating globalization, reflecting its neoliberal agenda. So I'd say that what has come up and what is being debated in Britain and most European questions are issues of solidarity and issues of division, particularly national solidarities against immigrants and refugees. And also that's being expressed through an underlying theme that there is or would be a problem of multiculturalism associated with cultural difference brought into Europe by migrant others. And this also gets argued to be a form of difference that undermines the solidarities necessary to sustain welfare states. So one sees these arguments are on the left and the right of the spectrum. So even if they're not, they're most strongly associated with right-wing ideologies, they're particularly found within left-wing responses to, and certainly again in Britain, there's something called Lexit, which is left exit from the European Union, which features. But what I want to say is that all of those things indicate the centrality of issues of race. That is, they are all about race and ethnicity. And yet most sociological approaches treat race as an exogenous factor, something entering European social structures from outside. And that's what I suggest to you is an aspect of a failure to address colonialism as a central aspect of the formation of those social structures. So as soon as we address the colonial background of Europe, we can understand how Europe's social structures are themselves racialized, and race is not an issue that is brought in from the outside. So, and this is, I think, in contrast to the way in which the European welfare state is typically understood. So I just referred sort of briefly to Esping Anderson's Worlds of Welfare, the different types of welfare regime within Europe, which he talks of 3 welfare regimes. They can be expanded, 4, 5, etc. But the idea of differentiated welfare regimes is crucial, but they're all differentiated around a default liberal position, I would suggest. And his worlds of welfare, which is what he calls them, the different types, have associated words of welfare, that is, typical forms of ideology and justifications. And it's those sort of ideologies and justifications which are, in a sense, being organized as the language of solidarities, and solidarities which exclude some within European discourses. Now, anybody familiar with Esping Anderson's work will know that these are presented entirely as developments after 1945, and in a sense as developments continuous with the formation of the European Union itself, from its initial EEC through into its current manifestation. And yet it's very difficult to understand the 3 types, except that they have much longer histories and origins. So, as I mentioned, the default liberal, associated with the UK in Europe and the US elsewhere, that embraces the primacy of the market, and in Esping Anderson's terms represents a limited kind of decommodification of work and access to resources. Obviously, liberalism has a much longer history and a much longer pattern of the formation of the United Kingdom than simply talking about it in post-1945 terms. Also, his other types, the statist corporatist, Germany, that's associated with status differentials, which Esping Anderson refers back to Bismarck, which places it at the moment of German unification, or, as I will suggest, the moment of German empire. And so the status differentials associated with the German welfare state are strongly bound up with a project which is not simply national, about the solidarities of the nation, it is imperial as well. And then the third type, the social democratic type, which is associated with Scandinavia. And from the point of view of the argument I'm going to make about the colonial origins of these types, of course, that's going to be the most difficult, alongside certain aspects of post-communist welfare type. So I'm imagining that were there anybody here from Sweden, they would be suggesting, well, empire and colonialism doesn't apply to us. And were there anybody here from Poland, which there is, of course, they would be saying, well, this is all very well, but it's about a Europe which is not ours. So what I'm going to do is, so the structure of the talk is to take the default liberal type, since each one is related to the liberal one. So if I can demonstrate the imperial structure of liberalism, then that is half the argument. And then I'm going to come back and say why this is central to understanding Poland and Scandinavia as well. So let's just say briefly what colonial Europe is about, and it's there in the very rhetoric of the European Union. The tendency is to present Europe itself as being created anew in the post-1945 period. That's why Esping Anderson's book has a strong ideological function for setting out something distinctive about Europe, which is not simply differentiating its forms of welfare from other forms, but also seeking to draw a line under a European past. And so the post-1945 period, the Second World War, is understood as an important moment in the ending of European colonialism. I think many people in the room will realise that European colonialism didn't end at this point. So what we could say is the original members of the EEC were all colonial powers. France, Netherlands and Belgium entered the European Union with colonies, making those colonies part of the European Union. They're not simply something which was outside. And of course, later joiners, UK, Spain and Portugal, were also colonial powers which had colonies when they joined. Britain was in the process of giving up some colonies, some willingly, others unwillingly. Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, for example, at more or less the same time as its negotiating entry into the European Union. And it's very clear that the EU was seen in relation to the changing relationship of Britain to empire and colonies. And I certainly hope people aren't following the debates in Britain at the moment, but the unofficial name of Brexit within the Department of Government that is negotiating exit is Empire 2.0, indicating there's an attempt to re-establish. So that aspect of at least nostalgia is present in the way in which Brexit was being seen. Obviously, Germany and Italy were colonial powers that had lost their colonies as a consequence of war, but one can also say that even Luxembourg was implicated in colonial and imperial projects. It had an economic union agreement with Belgium after 1921, and of course Belgium was one of the major imperial powers, and prior to that it had participation in the Zollverein arrangements of the German Empire. So the kinds of arrangements that the EU represents were previously articulated through empire and were continued in the EU, including continued imperial entanglement. So if anybody believes that the European Union has not had a war since its foundation, would have to ask why they treat the Algerian War of Independence as a war of independence from France and not from the European Union, of which Algeria was a member by virtue of its constitutional arrangements with France. And they'd also have to ask why a country which was a member of the European Union, Algeria, did not have the same welfare arrangements that were part of the agreement of the European Union. So labour laws were not the same for Algeria as they were for France. And this, of course, is a feature of all the colonial entanglements that European countries had. And finally, I suggest a book to read, P.O. Hansen and Stefan Jonsson's book on Eurafrica, and that is the project, the European project of domination within Africa, which is the 19th century project. The scramble for Africa continues and is reflected in European Union policy documents about how the European Union should orient externally in its relations of Africa. And it's not simply that countries accidentally had colonies when they joined the European Union, but there was a proposal for how the continuing colonies of Europe could be part of, if you like, a dowry for Europe as part of the European Union development. So these are at least aspects of the early period of the European Union which suggests that colonialism was not something that under which a line had been drawn, but something which develops strongly in terms of the political reflections on the project of Europe itself. So I think it would be false if we looked at the issue of Europe as if it was simply an aggregation of nation states, but instead to think of it as an aggregation of former colonial powers whose national structures were formed by that experience. As colonial powers, they were necessarily multicultural. So it's a bit ironic for Britain, for there to be a British political discourse against multiculturalism when the British political community was a multicultural community formed of Hindus, Muslims, Christians, etc., in terms of different religious bases. Of course, it wasn't a political community of equals, so multiculturalism was expressed in a form of racialized domination. And if you want a very crude version of what I think is happening in Britain in the critique of multiculturalism within current British discourse, is people have a problem with multiculturalism as a discourse of equality. They had no difficulty with multiculturalism as a discourse of domination and an expression of colonial ambition. And one can also say that it seems, this is a kind of obvious thing to say, but empire is based upon nothing other than the principle of movement. The principle of movement from the metropole throughout empire. And that kind of, and so if Europe now says there is a crisis of migration, one needs to think of, well, what was the crisis of migration when Europeans migrated elsewhere, and how did that structure the nature, not just the nature of the places to which people migrated, but also had implications within the domestic social structures at the metropole. So to be talking about post-colonial Europe is to be talking about how domestic structures were organized through colonialism and not simply the places to which people went. So, what I want to do now is just now concentrate much more straightforwardly on the liberal type, and I'm going to use Esping Anderson as the background of thinking about, and one of the reasons why I think it's important to talk about the liberal type is Esping Anderson says the liberal type is about commodification, and then institutionalized welfare states are about various degrees and forms of decommodification. Paradoxically, what Esping Anderson doesn't do is examine commodification and what commodification represents. He treats it as if commodification is simply an economic logic, an expression of the market. And the market is seen as antisocial. What Esping Anderson is doing is taking the arguments of Polanyi about markets, the antisocial market, and treating the formation of welfare states as a movement of the social against marketization or against commodification and decommodification. As soon as you make the welfare state, as soon as you construct that dichotomy between the market or an economic logic and the social, race becomes displaced from the market and economic logic to being a factor in the social. So race becomes an issue of how the social is formed, and it's not, and by implication, markets are not raced. And indeed, you have the paradoxical position where it looks as if the application of a market logic will undermine racialized difference rather than being the means by which racialized difference is reproduced. And obviously, since what I want to do is argue for the centrality of race, part of what I'm arguing for is to understand markets themselves as racialized structures. But what I want you to do is observe the countries that Esping Anderson groups as all part of the liberal type. The USA, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. These are all classic liberal countries, and they are all settler colonies. That is, each one of them is a white settler colony. The only exception is the United Kingdom, and the only thing that makes it an exception is that it's the promoter of settler colonization in its global sphere. So the UK promotes settlement in Australia, New Zealand, USA. And as settler colonies, they're all based upon dispossession. That is, the creation of settlers occurs through the enclosure movement. And if anybody's into one of the, I think Polanyi is an extremely good and valuable author to think about these things, and in many ways I prefer Polanyi to Marx simply because Polanyi links land, labour, and also money, the development of capital. But there's something curious about Polanyi's argument in The Great Transformation. He manages to write The Great Transformation, which is about the creation of the category of labour, the creation of labour as a commodity, as a consequence of an enclosure movement that dispossesses peasants within Europe. But he doesn't refer at all to the colonialism to which it gives rise. So colonialism is itself an enclosure movement, and it's an enclosure movement that dispossesses others, specifically indigenous people. And that's absent in the book. I mean, you could say that the classic theorist of liberalism, John Locke, who is treated, because of C.B. Macpherson's important book on the theory of possessive individualism, as writing as a precursor of capitalism, so writing 100 years before capitalism of capitalism, isn't it much more likely that Locke is writing about colonialism, particularly since he is a member, or he owns shares in plantation companies in the Carolinas and is a Lord Protector of one of the possessions. And Locke, once one reads him properly, I would suggest, is a theorist of colonial possession, justifying dispossession on the grounds that the colonists confront a terra nullius, a place in which there is no agriculture, no mixing of the labour with the land, and therefore the land is free to be taken, and as indeed it is taken by settlers. So liberalism begins in the settler colonies of British colonisation and justifies. Now, and then the paradox is that what liberalism does is remove that history from any self-understanding of its colonial foundation, to present its categories as simply universal or analytical categories with no sociological process underlying them. So let's go further and say why I think even the logic of the market is racialized. Because settlement is not simply about the displacement of others, it's also about getting others to work the various activities that displacement creates. So settlement comes alongside enslavement. And that's the history of British colonisation, it's the history of Spanish, Portuguese colonisation, all so-called New World colonisation. So if I say it's odd that Polanyi fails to discuss colonialism as part of the enclosure movement that creates the idea of labour as a commodity, the further paradox is that he doesn't discuss enslavement as one of the commodity forms that labour takes. And if you look at his definition of what the commodity of labour is, and it's the same definition that Marx uses, so the critique of Polanyi applies also to Marx. The sale of labour power as a commodity is a fiction, Polanyi says. That's part of his argument for the antisocial nature of the market. Labour is only another name for human activity which goes with life itself, which in turn is not produced for sale, but for entirely different reasons. Nor can that activity be detached from the rest of life, be distorted or mobilized. So in talking about labour power as a commodity, the problem that Polanyi is pointing to that makes it a fiction is solved, this is in heavy ironic inverted commas, solved by the idea of enslavement, because enslavement constitutes the labourer as a commodity, and that does allow the storage and mobilisation independently of the will of the labourer. That's what unfree labour means. So what I'm arguing at this point is that if we bring slavery into the equation and say the point at which Polanyi is theorising the emergence of capitalism and the status of labour as a commodity, there are two forms of the status of labour as a commodity. The labourer commodified and enslaved, and labour power with the labourer having free will and not enslaved, merely entering into contracts on the basis of claims to his or her own labour. And Polanyi doesn't discuss that division, but as soon as I ask you, well, who would be identified as appropriate for one or other of the categories, you realise that we're not in a discussion of economic logic, but a social discussion of, in effect, moral economy. And so, from the perspective I'm putting forward, the form that Esping Anderson uses as the default form, the pure type from which decommodification moves, is itself already a decommodified or partly decommodified labour, because it says that on a basis of morality one cannot enslave fellow religionists or fellow members of your political community or of your community. It's a racialized moral economy. So I put it to you that liberalism enters as a racialized structure. And what the social sciences do, sociology included, is in a sense remove that moment that establishes and defines what the categories of so-called political economy are. It separates them from the social, and in separating them from the social makes race an extrinsic category, something that comes in from outside through the social, rather than something that's already been brought in. And one could say, paraphrasing or utilizing Barack Obama's statement about slavery being the original stain in the American Constitution, I'd suggest this is the original stain in the liberal Constitution. So, what of Sweden and Poland? So, to what extent? So, in effect, what I'm saying is liberal individualism is colonial individualism, and we're still in Europe trapped in a certain kind of unconscious post-colonial moment. But what of Sweden and Poland? Well, one of the things that people say about Sweden and Scandinavia is, yeah, they had an attempt at colonization and an attempt at empire, but were already overtaken by other European powers, such that Scandinavia gave up its imperial ambitions at a very early stage. And in some sense, that giving up of imperial ambitions is part of the explanation of why they're different. So I think, well, it's not correct to say that Sweden was uninvolved with colonialism. Dispossession and displacement of Sami people is the same treatment of indigenous people in the north of Europe as is taking place in the New World. But also the incredibly important thing is, so what I want to return to is the issue of migration. Because in the 19th century, emigration from Europe is a massive consequence of the enclosure movement. And I think it's a mistake if we associate colonialism simply with the actions of states and not understand how, under the actions of states, individuals within Europe become agents of colonialism. And that includes individuals within countries which are not colonial powers, and in migrating, alter the local context for labour, as well as creating what European imperialism is in essence. So Poland, the reason why we're in this Znaniecki building, the reason why Znaniecki can write about the Polish peasant is the migration of the Polish peasants as a consequence of German imperialism and the Germanification in Polish lands occupied by Germany. Polish peasants are displaced and move to America, and in America they displace Native Americans. And the same is true of Swedish migration as well. Sweden has one of the largest migrations in the last quarter of the 19th century of any European countries. Something like a third of the population migrates. And in migrating, they have consequences, and those consequences are those of secular colonialism. So one of the interesting things is to look at, go back and look at some sociological texts. As I said, one goes back to look at Polanyi and discover Polanyi is writing all about this and makes not a mention of it. But also de Tocqueville writes about these processes as well. So de Tocqueville's Democracy in America has a chapter, the chapter on the three races that occupy the land of the United States. He says that democracy in America is associated only with one of those races, and that is white settlers, primarily Anglo-American in his terms. But he says there are two other groups, enslaved Africans and indigenous Americans. And he says the book Democracy in America does not say anything about those two. They do not participate in the institutions that are being described, but are defined by the non-applicability of of democracy and rights being applied to them. But when he's writing the book in the 1840s, he's witnessing two movements. The first movement of African Americans north to escape southern enslavement, and he's also witnessing the movement of European populations in, and he's witnessing the removal of Native Americans. So he witnesses the Trail of Tears of the Cherokee people being moved off their land and their land being given to others. And he writes in this long chapter about this. But he also says there will be two consequences in America. One is a process which he calls a genocidal process towards Native Americans, driven by European settlement. And the other process is the creation of a racialized labor market in the north. So he connects enslavement with the movement of African Americans to the north, but within the north, the racial prejudice constructed in the south and the influx of European migrants creates a racialized structure in the north. And that is the legacy of Europe for America. That is, Trump's America is partly our doing. So I'd say that it's not, it's not correct to see that countries which were not actively involved in state-sponsored colonialism were not themselves actively involved through other measures. And most European countries had societies to facilitate migration to the US and to create entities within North America, and not one country sending and creating resources for Italians in America, Germans in America, Poles in America, gave a single thought to the issue of multiculturalism in transporting their culture elsewhere. So the final point about, say, since the the legacy that Europe is still engaged with, or the legacy in particular that Germany is engaging with, is how do we understand German unification? And I would say that for most of us in the sociological discussion, it's about the creation of a German nation state. But again, if one goes back and read the texts at the time, that is the texts of sociologists, it's an imperial racial project to the east in Prussia, which is a project of Germanification of Jews and Poles, and it's a project to the south in terms of the export of new labour practices to to Africa. There's a recent book by Andrew Zimmerman called Alabama in Africa that looks at taking plantation practices in America to the German colonies in Africa. And the German Verein für Socjologii discusses both issues together. German project of empire in Africa and the Germanification in Eastern Europe. And one could say that the tragedy of that process, I mean, the benefit for Poles in the post-First World period is to have a state, and the disadvantage for Jews is to be rendered stateless after a process of racialization. But the process of racialization of Jews in Europe is part of the same process of racialization in Africa and in other colonies. And Suava mentioned my first job, which was at the University of Tasmania. If people know about that, it's the site of one of the first genocides of indigenous people. And there's been recent writing about the genocide of Tasmanians, because it's become forgotten within British history, but it was written about on a daily basis. So there were articles in the Times newspaper about the genocide taking place in the late 19th century. And the report said it's terrible what is being done in the name of a colony or a dominion of the United Kingdom. But there is little that the British state could do about that, because what was being exercised in Australia, in Tasmania, were the rights of private property. And so liberalism, its claims of private property and so on, which are frequently presented as neutral, universalizable categories, are, I would suggest, bound up with racial orders which continue to structure and undermine the possibilities of democracy in Europe. That's it.